and gaming and yeah, I missed the festival, the proper festival, but then they were involved with the school, and so I did about 6 hours of lecturing there.
We have a games major, graphic design major, no animation major, although there's talk of starting one. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture. This is organized by Visual Communication Design and part of the Games Now lecture series and the Game Jam that's happening today. My name is Zach Dodson. I'm a professor in Visual Communication Design. With Mika Junila, we've organized this lecture for you today. And we're really excited about today's presenter. He spent 25 years in various industries, games then, games now, a long time at Pixar doing animation, graphic design, visual storytelling of all sorts. So he knows a lot about a lot of stuff, and I'm really excited to present to you Mark Holmes. So please give him a hand.
Now you know who I am. Who are you? Give me names. No, I'm kidding. Thank you for having me. So this is my first time in Helsinki, in Finland, and I'm having a great time. And I've been invited here to kind of speak at a couple of conferences and festivals, and it was a great opportunity for me to come up here and meet you guys and share a little bit of what I know. And My talk with you guys is not like a formal thing. I don't have like necessarily a consistent or clear kind of message I want to bring. I want this to be a little bit of a conversation, just to see what you guys are interested in, and then kind of what from my background I can kind of share with you guys that can inspire you, or maybe give you an idea of how things happen kind of in my part of the industry. Or kind of get into academic, kind of a deeper understanding of things too. So we can kind of go in a lot of directions. I'm going to start off and just give you kind of a gross overview of me, which will hopefully begin to maybe get some questions flying in your heads. And then from there, again, we can go into any number of areas. And if I don't get direction from you guys, I'm going to pick the most boring thing I can and make you sit through it. So, anyway, and this slideshow I'm showing, it was from another talk I gave, so this won't necessarily be just about art lessons and art directing, but so that's me, not so long ago, well, actually very long ago, and I always, from a very young age, liked to draw. My mom said that I just would sit down with a pencil and just be drawing things, like it was almost like it was pre-programmed. That never really went away. As I grew up, I kind of became this sort of, super nerdy kid. I was really into comic books, and I went through a phase of like role-playing games and things, and I loved kind of imagination and storytelling and sort of escapism. And because I could draw, not only could I like consume it by reading comics and things, but I could also kind of start to create my own. And it kind of made me realize that I could begin creating the things that I loved to consume. And I really wanted to be like a comic artist or something. And so this is like high school through college, maybe even a little early before high school. And I would be drawing my friends, and I'd be turning us into crazy clowns or turning us into superheroes, or I would be making up stories. So for me, my love for art was never about the image itself, but rather these worlds and fantasies that I could try to give a glimpse of life into. My professional career, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I didn't even know that you could be a paid artist or have a career in the arts until I went to college, and I saw the college catalog, and I saw you could take art classes, and I'm like, what? You can do that? I thought I would be an accountant or something. I was pretty naive. And I began taking some graphic design classes, illustration classes. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I also wasn't a great student. I wasn't motivated in my classes in the way that I was motivated to do art for myself or to do art for other people. And coincidentally, I ended up getting a job for my college campus almost like the month I started as a student. And it was the only paid student position for the body of students who would organize all of the school's functions in terms of like speaking events, stuff like this, concerts, movies, lecturers, what have you. And I was the graphic designer. And they had just bought, like, I think a Mac 2. And the guy who bought it, who knew how to use it, basically, he was quitting the day I was being hired. So he said, here's the computer, here's how you use it, see ya. And I had never used the Mac before. I was using PageMaker, which was an old graphic design layout program. And I was freaked out. And not only that, but I'm left-handed, and this Mac only had a right-handed mouse. And so it's kind of like, imagine you taking art classes for the first time, or you have a test or something, and you have to use your other hand. And anyway, so it was a challenge. But as you can see, I quickly began to master it and do amazing designs. Like this, I won, I think, an award for the yellow one there for best graphic design of that year. But it was like, again, it was sort of learning about the power of desktop publishing and having to think like a designer as opposed to someone who would just draw. I would draw some of these things, or well, the one on the bottom I drew, but I almost wanted to draw instead. But for me, then actually, I had that job for about 2 years, and then while I was struggling through school and not appreciating school, I was actually paying for school and paying for the, I didn't get the classes I wanted, I get other classes, and I grew frustrated, but I was getting paid to learn working, so I decided to take a chance and let my career be my education. And I don't recommend that for everyone because my education is quite spotty, and there's a lot of things I wished I could do that I still can't do. But you know, that was the price that I kind of took on. During this time, this was, you know, there were a lot of kind of innovations in technology. One of the big ones for me that I think kind of opened the door to the rest of my career was the CD-ROM had come out. So CDs had been out for a little while. You know, I was switching from cassettes to CDs. And then the CD-ROM came out where you could, developers could now, instead of releasing a game on floppy disks, which would hold maybe 1.5 meg on a disk or something, now you had CD-ROMs that could hold 700 megs. And suddenly, all the constraints of early gaming was gone. You know, usually you would have like pixel artists doing a lot of pixel pushing, and you'd have very low fidelity art to fit on this very limited storage medium. You would buy a game and it would come on 10 floppy disks, and you have to kind of keep installing each one. So now you could put so much content, high fidelity art. And so game companies were hiring artists left, right, and center. If you could draw, if you could, you know, if you knew what a computer looked like, they would hire you. So I got swept up into that. First through kind of an educational software company where I began learning like Photoshop 1.0 and all these early art tools. They hired about 60 of us artists. We all got trained in various tools, and they laid us all off. And then from there, we all scattered to game companies. And ironically, my first, even though there was this whole renaissance in really high fidelity gaming at that time, the first game I did was this game called Battle Bugs in the upper left there. And it was I think like a 4-bit, we had 16 colors. It was on floppy disks. They were optimizing the game for low-end devices because they wanted to be able to get the widest possible audience. And it was an amazing game. It was me, one other artist. We designed, animated, did everything in the game. We had one programmer, and I think we had one level designer. And so it was like true indie back then. But unfortunately, the game didn't really sell because everybody was moving to the high-end devices. Everyone wanted the new exciting content, and this sort of like, it wasn't trying to be retro, it was just kind of this sort of last attempt at the sort of older generation of game. And it was a shame because it was a really fun game. But after that, I then did a few things in the industry. I ended up going to a company called Rocket Science. They were on the cover of Wired magazine. They were the biggest, most hyped company at that time. And they were being hyped as the marriage between Hollywood and gaming. Because as art was getting better and better in gaming, and CG animation was becoming more accessible. I mean, a lot of CG was still done on like workstations back then. You'd have to have the Silicon Valley machines, SGIs, or you'd be using Softimage or Alias or something, and it was like you're paying tens of thousands of dollars for a seat. So it wasn't that accessible, and this is the stuff Hollywood was using. But these guys raised a ton of investment money. They went out and hired a bunch of people from Industrial Light and Magic. They hired the production designer from movies like Conan the Barbarian, and he'd worked on Alien and a bunch of other films, this guy Ron Cobb. And then they went and kind of stole the entire QuickTime team from Apple, the people that wrote QuickTime. And they had this magic formula between doing high-end special effects, doing QuickTime was all about the video compression. You could squeeze a movie way down and fit it on a CD. And then I think when they brought me in, I was the only person there, only artist there with any gaming experience. Because I had been in games for about 3 or 4 years prior to them bringing me on. And it seemed like a great idea, and they had a ton of money, and they would have like these exquisite catered meals of gourmet food and big parties, and they had this like catalog of all these things that with their merchandise. Like when you bought the game was like, you know, like in a little box, but the box was heavy because of this catalog of like rocket science stuff you could buy, jackets and t-shirts and toys, and they were just kind of full of themselves in a way, and they thought that just by bringing a high fidelity experience to gaming, that would be that would marry the fantasies people crave between gaming and film. But it didn't work that way. And the games they made were actually quite boring. They were full motion video games. So they would basically render out, say, like a Star Wars chase scene through the Death Star, right? Which is cool. And when you see that in the movie, you want to play that as a game. Well, if you can imagine that as a movie, but then you just have a little sprite going boop, 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 boop. across the screen, and you're kind of controlling the little sprite, and you're shooting other little sprites, and the movie's got nothing to do with the game. So that was kind of the games they were doing in a way. And they just weren't fun, and in the end, the company went bankrupt, as did Epix, the first company. Pretty much, I think all the companies I ever worked for went bankrupt. So I decided maybe I should leave gaming and spare the rest of the industry. So I did a lot of things. I liked to draw. Again, I was still drawing monsters and robots. I liked designing little goofy graphics and things. And I really wanted to be a character designer. I thought, yeah, characters are easy. I could do that, because I thought backgrounds were boring. And around this time, as I was working in games, I kind of climbed up the ranks pretty quickly. Within a couple of years, I was art directing. I had done everything from some super simple 2D animation to background art, visual effects animation, 3D modeling. I was one of the early beta testers on the beta version of 3D Studio Max. Texture painting, matte painting, storyboarding. I mean, you just did everything in games, and I love that. But then I had an opportunity to work on a commercial, and the commercials are, I never wanted to get into games. I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. I had sort of fallen into it because game companies were everywhere. But my fantasy had really been to get into film, some kind of storytelling. Filmmaking, I wanted to be a screenwriter. So when I got an opportunity to work on a commercial, I was like, wow, that's kind of like a movie, or it's like, at least it's on TV. So I decided to jump for that, because again, I wasn't a big gamer, and the games didn't speak to me. So I ended up working on this commercial. It was using CGI. And I remember it was a Coca-Cola commercial, and it was for some obscure little company really far away. And it was just like a little, they were in a big building, but kind of a small part of the big building. And they didn't have a desk for me. I would freelance. I'd come in for a couple of weeks, work on the commercial, and go back to gaming. And the funny thing is the desk I was at, they didn't have a desk for me, so they had me sit at the public scanning station. They had one scanner for the company. And so as I'm working, and commercials are a very fast deadline, and every 5 minutes someone comes in needing to scan something. So I have to get up. And back in those days, the scanner was like, but it's like multipass. And then after a while, people were asking me to scan things for them. And I'm like, Jesus, and and I meet these guys. There's some guy named Pete Doctor, some guy named Andrew Stetton. Thanks, Mark, thanks for scanning this. And they go run off and they do something else. I don't know what they do because there's only a few people in the commercial group. And then later, I went to see this movie called Toy Story when it came out, and I realized, wait, that's the company I work for. I had no idea they were making a movie. So I ended up going back there and making lots of commercials with them. I even worked on the Toy Story ABC interstitials for TV. And I was doing things like graphic design. I was doing texture painting. I was doing matte painting. Basically just kind of like a digital artist. And I really wanted to work there, so I did what anybody would have done. I applied. And then I got rejected. And I applied again, and I got rejected again, which I thought was ironic because I was working for them. And I just decided, well, I guess it's just, I'm just going to be the kind of guy that when they need me, they give me a call, I rush over, work there for a week or two, and then go back to gaming, and then I mope. But then a couple things happened. So one was I went back, and I was working on a game for my then girlfriend, now wife, then boss, now boss. She was a creative director for a project at another game company, and so I was doing concept art for her. And it was this sort of environmental stuff. And I hated environments. I didn't want to do environments, but I like the characters. But I was getting to do, I was helping with the game design, I was helping with the story, I was modeling characters, I was helping build the prototype. So it was fun. And then I was working on one of the interstitials for Toy Story. Excuse me. I've been talking nonstop for like 6 days. So my voice might just suddenly cut out. It won't be the mic, it'll be my voice. My producer was like, God, Mark, why don't you just work with us? Why is it you only want to freelance? Because we could really use you. And I said, are you kidding me? It's like, you guys have rejected me twice. I'm surprised I haven't tried to kill myself. And she says, well, who did you send your work to? And I said, well, HR. And she just kind of looks at me like I'm an idiot. She says, don't do that. Give it to me. So then she takes it around to the art department, and I end up getting an interview, and they end up hiring me. But not as a, well, they do hire me as a character production artist, but they actually, the reason they hired me was they loved my environments, because I was not a character artist. These are not, where are they? These are not character drawings. Those are just drawings. Character design is about bringing something to life. It's about creating a character with appeal and performance, and it feels alive, and there's storytelling to it. I was just drawing funny shapes. But ironically, my backgrounds had character. My backgrounds had more character than my characters had. And they love that, because not many people can do that. I was a little lazy with my perspective sometimes, but I still abided by decent perspective, but I kind of caricatured the perspective. I kind of forced the wide angle or how I did things, or how the drawings were a little lazy and there was a little more gesture to them. So they really thought that was actually, to them, more interesting. So they ended up hiring me as a production artist. And I think I'll go through some of that here. So this would have been back, also the other reason they didn't hire me was because when I did apply the first couple of times, Toy Story had had been released, and it was in early visual development. So there's often a long gap. There's a life cycle to a film, and actually I'll explain the life cycle here. Here's a couple of photos of Pixar. I actually wish I have another slideshow I've given to, when I talk to little kids sometimes, I'll actually say, who wants to go to Pixar? And they all raise their hands, and then I have a whole slideshow of like walking through Pixar and showing them all the cool stuff. So I wish I had that here. I don't. But and then they're really disappointed because I lied to them. But so this is kind of an example of the pipeline, and this is sort of, I'll explain this to you. I think most of you already are familiar with the pipeline, but I'll kind of give it to you in maybe different terms. And this also kind of gives you a picture of the role that I fill into and the demands of the job. So this is sort of like a, whatever the length of time is, life cycle for a film. So it starts off with an idea that is eventually turns into a treatment, or maybe it turns into a script. And then that idea will get greenlit. In the case of Pixar, the idea has to come from a director. Any director has to pitch 3 ideas. One of the ideas is picked, and they make it. Other animation studios have a development department where they just develop all these ideas or buy all these ideas, and they have a library. They bring a director in, and they say, pick one of these to make. And Pixar did not want to do that, because instead of you interpreting someone else's idea, they want you to be interpreting your own idea. It's more personal, it's more authentic. So anyway, so there's like a development process, or it's just the director maybe a director and a head of story, or maybe a couple of story people. They start eventually building, storyboarding the treatment and building a reel, which is basically just the storyboards cut in time. It's like an animatic. And that can go on for some period of time. And eventually, once that, they have either it could be an act, it could be all 3 acts. Ideally, it should be all 3 acts. But there's like a first pass at some level of completion. And then the company says, we have enough faith in this. We're going to greenlight it for pre-production. So pre-production, there's a stage of visual development where you go and and visual development even kind of precedes pre-production a little bit, but it's basically, you just go out to a bunch of artists. You say it's a movie about a father fish who loses his son, and he has to explore the ocean and find his father. We have these ideas of a submarine and this and that. And then you have all these amazing artists with very strong, distinctive visual styles, all interpreting that idea and exploring ideas for that idea. And that becomes a part of also of the internal pitch of, here's the idea, here's ways it could be expressed, or here's the potential. And it just gets people excited about where it can go. Eventually, you start going through the art department comes in. You have a production designer who's responsible for the look of the entire movie. You have art directors who are responsible for vertical slices of the production. So you'd have a character art director, or set art director, a lighting art director, sometimes a graphics art director, and other roles. And then you have the art team, the grunts, people like me who are brought in. And the work ranges from being a designer, where you have to, you have a scene that happens in the stage, and you have to design how big is the stage, how many windows are there, it has to accommodate the action of the film. And then you've got kind of then all the detail work that has to be done. Every chair has to be designed, this stuff has to be figured out, the doors have to be designed, and have to be sized relative to the characters. I mean, every single detail has to be built. So you have, when I was brought in as a production artist, my job was basically they'd give me a design and I'd have to like figure out every single detail and make sure it completely worked, and then make sure that could be communicated to all the other teams. And then you have this the rest of production, where you've got things being modeled, you've got a layout reel happening, you've got models being textured, you've got character models being built and being rigged and being animated, you've got scenes being lit, you've got matte paints and compositing elements going in and visual effects. There's just, you've got hundreds and hundreds of people. You could have 500 people working on a film over a span of, not all at once, but this whole span could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, depends on the film, and the process. Excuse me. The thing about Pixar also is that what makes them unique is that they never lock story. Story keeps evolving because as you're making the story, as you're iterating the story, as you're putting all the pieces together, you're discovering things, you're discovering what works, what doesn't work, you're getting better ideas downstream. And so you're constantly changing stuff. And it's art's job to interpret the storyboards, to make sure that the storyboard can be implemented in a way that's visually appealing, that is visually engaging, that communicates the intent of the story, that serves the needs of the story. And every single second on screen, everything has to be designed. And then everybody else is making it. So if you can imagine, you get these storyboards, you start designing the thing, because all these people are waiting for work, you hand it off, and the story changes. Oh, wait, go back, redesign it, here's a new thing. And so art is in this interesting position between, squeezed between story, where it's this, again, there's an impermanence, a constant organic redoing of things. And then there's the specificity of there's a hard deadline, we have to ship this movie in time, it's got to be lit by this time, it's got to be rendered by this time, or what have you. And so we're constantly being squeezed. And so my little grommet thing here is kind of like, I think of like production as a train, and you've got the story guys, throwing all the coal in the train and making it go, and art's kind of like trying to lay out the track so it all doesn't just crash and burn. But I'm sure every department can see themselves as that too, but I just wanted to be a little dramatic. So I was there for 16 years, including the commercial time. I worked on about 10 movies, I think. I worked on theme parks, commercials, consumer products, DVDs, documentaries, lots of things. Lots of things there. And again, these are some examples of the work I did. So this is like some of my early work, like as a production artist. So you can see A Bug's Life stuff, you can see Monsters, Inc., a little bit of Incredibles. So it's like, again, it's solving the details, it's helping design sets, it's a lot of problem solving, it's communicating things. So even things like Mike Wazowski, it's like when you're going to make Mike, you have to know every detail about him. Like what does his mouth bag look like, right? How big is his tongue? Where's his epiglottis in case he laughs and opens his mouth in front of the camera? How many finger bends does he have? How many wrinkles are there with each finger bend? How do we get the expressions he needs so that the articulators know how to rig the characters? The door vault. It's like how big does a door vault need to be? I think I even calculated how many doors it held. It was like some hundreds of millions of doors because it's all the doors in the world, right? I mean, it was total fake math. But A Bug's Life, this is a funny anecdote. So being an artist, being a production artist, a concept artist, again, it's not about the drawing. It's about the idea. It's about communicating an intent. So they had some nice art, some inspirational art for that scene in A Bug's Life where they go into under the house, into the bug city, and in the bug bar. So they gave me these paintings and said, we love these paintings, we love this idea, make it work. So I don't know how to make this work, but I just thought, okay, well, first of all, we have to work out this world in a rational scale. This is a bug scale. It's got to be a consistent scale. This is in 3D. Everything has to be consistent. It has to be believable to the audience. In my house, we have a kind of a tall basement, sort of the foundation of our house. And there was no subflooring. It was just dirt. And we would just dump all this garbage into the house. It was probably like kindling for a fire someday. And so I went down there, and I cleared out some of the space. I set up some boxes. I set up a phone book, Coca-Cola bottle. And the goal for the scene, this is when Flick goes into Bug City, for the country bumpkin goes into the city for the first time, and it's like Times Square. So how do you do an insect version of Times Square? So I had pictures of Times Square, so then I tried to rebuild it out of like actual stuff that would be roughly the scale that Times Square would be to an ant. And so then I laid down on the dirt with a camera and I took pictures of it. And that was kind of like the starting point for me to start composing art and also figuring out if we want that iconic Times Square kind of, Flatiron building kind of thing with the billboard and the streets kind of going off, that could have been any number of things stacked. And I probably did 20, 30, 40 drawings of different configurations of things. We wanted to have lighting in there, like illuminated signs. And so we were experimenting with how do we motivate the light in a way that's believable. And ultimately we did fireflies and I think some Christmas lights. But again, it was just so much problem solving. It wasn't about the drawing at all. The drawing is communicating the ideas. And then the bug bar was a fun one too, where I just thought, okay, well, it's in a can, and they wanted to evoke there were a couple of cinematic touchstones. There was a scene in The Shining where Jack Nicholson's at the bar at the end. He's talking to the kind of devil character, and there's a certain aesthetic that it had, and they really wanted that. So I had to like have a bar in this bug bar, and the characters had to be sitting in seats. There was going to be a fight or a chase scene in there. So I actually just went and got some cardstock and wrapped it around and made it kind of in the size of a can. And then I found bottle caps and popsicle sticks and a pocket knife and a few other things. And I just kind of glued them into this can shape. And then I even cut out the characters at the scale they would be. And then that helped me figure out, okay, these bottle caps are too big, or this can is too big or too small. Like, is it a paint can? Is it a soup can? So it helped me find which props would work in the context of the story. And then we even had a little fiber optic camera that we kind of pushed through the set, and we could kind of make sure we can get the staging we want. So that's an example, again, of art is a means to an end. You're trying to pre-visualize something. You're trying to make sure that it's going to work. It's going to answer questions and meet needs. But there's other ways of exploring how you do that. It could be a sketch. It could be a painting. It could be a 3D model, what have you. And then I moved more into a set design role, which I can go into as well. So then I did a graphic design because I was the only person there who knew Illustrator. And so I was doing character production art, I was doing environmental production art, and I was doing graphic design for the first couple of films. And after that, I was not a good character artist. Character was too hard because character was about all these other things, and it's a skill unto itself. So I decided to focus on set design and graphic design. And so I was involved in a lot of the graphics. I did a lot of the graphics, most of the graphics for Incredibles and for some of the other films. I was the graphics art director in Wall-E, and then I had a chance to, and I'll tell you a little bit about graphics. I think most of you, hopefully, don't ever really pay attention to the graphics in the movies. And I don't mean the computer graphics, I mean the graphic design in the films. I mean, there's two kinds of graphic design that's used in the movies typically. There's the kind of storytelling or expositional graphics, like a newspaper headline. Newspaper flies up with a headline and it says so-and-so is in jail or whatever, right? That's storytelling, and that's using graphics. So we have a lot of that, obviously, but most of the graphics are more subtextual or more ambient or more environmental, that they're little details. Like, where's a good example? I don't know if you can see this, like Aalto Festival 2017. Oh, the logo on that whiteboard, right? If we had a CG movie and you had no logos on that, it would start to feel a little synthetic, a little fake. And by just adding these little details that you kind of expect in life, there's always some kind of label or warning, this kind of stuff, that just helps ground things in reality. Because no CG character is going to trip and fall and hurt themselves here, right? Because they're CG. But in their world, they could trip and fall, so you need to have a warning sign there. So it makes it more believable. So that's where a lot of the graphics come into play. And we can obviously go more into graphics later. I had a chance to production design the short film Lifted, which was the one with the alien, the flying saucer one. And that was my first chance to kind of go from being a production artist where you're thinking about details and communicating details to being a set designer where you're thinking about a larger space, a larger set, and everything within the set. Being an art director where you're thinking about an entire sort of vertical slice of production where you're thinking about it sequence by sequence. You're thinking about how does all this stuff relate to the production design of the film, how does it support story, how does it work with other design elements. And then production designers are designing everything. So in this case, with the exception of the characters, which I was involved with, but they had been largely designed by the time I came on, I had to figure out everything. And I had to bring a reason for why things looked the way they did. And it had to be done in a way that served the story. So that sums up my, let me see if I got anything else here. Hang on. There was something. I'm going to be bouncing between presentations here, so you get to see the man behind the curtain a little bit. I wanted to show you. Oh, it's over there. Maybe this won't work. I have to drive. I thought that's fine. We'll just stick with this presentation. So, where's my mouse? Okay, so I'll stop with that. So that was Pixar, and then after Pixar, I decided to leave because I wasn't growing anymore. I wasn't being challenged. Pixar had kind of gone from a place of a lot of innovation and risk-taking to being kind of more about optimizing, how to do things more effectively, how to bring costs down, that kind of stuff. I'd worked on multiple sequels, I'd worked on the toys, the Cars shorts, and I just sort of wasn't being challenged anymore, and I was also being funneled into a very narrow role. So I decided to leave with no job during the economic crisis, that was not terribly smart, but I was lucky enough to kind of land with a couple of guys making a game company. And so we kind of made this company together, and I put out a game called Counter Spy. And I'll be showing this to you shortly. But I did that for about 3-4 years. The company, unfortunately, went under. We did put out a game that got a lot of notice and a lot of attention, especially for the visual style of the game and the kind of the fiction of the game. After that, I went to Google for about 1.5 years to help with the Doodle team and designing. I designed some doodles, but more often I was trying to help art direct and kind of level up the team, help them expand into other kind of services within Google. And then now, most recently, I'm kind of a consulting creative director, art director. I art directed a VR game, or helped art direct a VR game for a company. I've done some other design, even some recent print design work with this sort of smart paper that you can touch, and it can actually send signals to your phone or a device. So it's almost like an interactive surface. And then I'm working art directing a mobile game now as a consulting art director. And then I'm also advising a VR company here in Helsinki called Third Eye. And they have an amazing VR project they're putting together. So sorry I didn't have the visuals for that part. I actually have that in another presentation. But all of that being said, so you have a sense about me now, my background. I'm curious if there's anything in particular. Well, one, if you have questions first about my journey, ask me. But other than that, I'm kind of curious what would be interesting to you guys. I can do. I know it's all going to be interesting, but we have only so much time. So what I have, so what's on the menu today is I can talk about some of the set design on The Incredibles. I can talk about some art directing a sequence in WALL-E. I can talk about art directing the game Counter Spy, which is a very deep dive. There's a lot of stuff in that covers everything from character design to set design, world building, graphic design, interface design, you name it. I can talk about production designing the short film Lifted. I can talk about Google, and what have you. So, or I could just race through all of them super quickly, and you'll get nothing. But let's start off. I mean, do you guys have any questions for me, just in terms of kind of my career as it has been? The range of stuff I've been a part of. Yeah, thank you. Brave man.
Hello.
Hi.
So how much do you trust your own intuition when designing art and whatever in these projects?
Why did you have to ask me that? I trusted my own intuition zero for most of my career. And this, interestingly, feeds into my deciding to leave Pixar. A lot of my career, because I never went to school, excuse me, if you guys have a bottled water or something, that might be good for me. I think my voice is going to be collapsing pretty soon. What I was really good at, I had good basic fundamental skills, drawing skills and stuff, but when I was going into the job, I wasn't doing my own thing. I was doing things for other people. And I think where, even in school, I wasn't a great student, I kind of didn't care, but in the job, in the workplace, it really mattered a lot to me that the people I was working for were getting what they wanted, what they needed from me. Like, maybe it was a fear of failure or a fear of being fired or whatever. But also, it's like I was very adaptive, and I could adapt to any style. I could learn things quickly. So throughout my career, I never really developed my own artistic voice, my own artistic sensibility. I was sort of dependent on the people I was working with to tell me, is it good enough or not? And ironically, in games, invariably, anything I did was great. When I went to Pixar, invariably, anything I ever did was not great. It was a really, really hard adjustment because I could do something once or twice in games and get it approved. And when I went to Pixar, I could draw it 10 times, 50 times, 100 times, and it still wasn't good enough. Or it didn't get it wasn't the right idea yet. And I used to think that every day I was just going to be fired. Like, fire me. I'm failing. I'm constantly failing. And tragically, I felt that way for years until I realized that Pixar, to them, it wasn't about a drawing or specific thing. It was a process. It was a process of exploring ideas, of trying ideas, of getting bad ideas out, of thinking outside the box. And sometimes you'd do this big circle, you'd come back to the first idea, but at least it was sort of validated. You knew that was the right idea then. But I was also working with a lot of very strong artistic leaders, and they varied. Some of them knew exactly what they wanted. Some of them knew exactly what they wanted, and they didn't. Thank you, sir. You want to just here? I'll try not to spill it on my laptop. Okay. So for a lot of my career at Pixar too, my ego was being kind of like shredded, and gradually I began to learn that they're not criticizing me. It wasn't that my work was bad. It was just that sometimes the process takes a while to get that right design, or to prove it's the right design, or to explore lots of options to find something that maybe they would never have thought of before that could be a better idea and use that instead. And then again, depending on the sort of leadership I had, some were very much like they wanted their thing their way, and you work like this, you draw like this. And then as I would go to different people, I would have to keep adapting to how they worked and what they wanted. And it wasn't until I worked with Brad Bird on The Incredibles where the first time I sit down with him, he's like, okay, Mark, what do you think we should do? And I'm like, I don't know, you're the director, you tell me, I don't think. And he's like, I don't want to hear that. I never want to hear that. It's like you and all of you are here because you're good at what you do, and you can make my idea better than I can make it myself. And so that began to force me to start to find kind of my own instincts and my own voice a little bit. But even still, there were still degrees of doubt, or being in this kind of collaborative role. Like if you're working in a big collaborative project, you are a collaborator, and you are having to learn to work with other people, and most often in support of other people, support of a director or an art director. So as a service provider, again, it wasn't a chance for me to really develop my instincts because I would really be leaning on cues from them. And it wasn't until I left Pixar, I left because I wanted to begin to figure out who I was, what are my instincts outside of that. And Counterspy, for me, was that journey. I began to find a voice, and I began to trust my instincts. It still took a while. And I'm still, you know, I still have doubts sometimes, but I think, again, a part of that is just artistic nature. So a long answer, but yeah, thanks for asking that one. Is there an easier question?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a screenwriter, so I'm interested in the screenwriting or the story development process in Pixar.
Good.
So basically, you said that the story develops throughout the work process and journey. Could you still talk a bit more about that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I will go to that talk. Thank you. All right, so now we know what's next course up on the menu here. I'm going to have to do this and close your eyes. Don't look at my stuff. Let's do, I'm going to power through WALL-E. This might be a little intense. I'll try not to, but this will give you a pretty explicit answer to that question, I think. So, as art director for the graphic design of the film, there were a lot of graphics in that movie. And the graphics are aesthetic, they're environmental, they do storytelling. And this sequence is called Axiom Tour. Did you see, I mean, I'm assuming, have you all seen WALL-E or? Okay, good. This is well, just to make it easier, I don't have to explain as much. This is the sequence where Wally's met Eve, he fell in love with Eve, she got shut down, she got taken away, and he's chasing after her. He jumps on the ship, gets pulled into the big ship called the Axiom, and she's being pulled off to be taken up to the bridge, and he's chasing her. So this sequence goes from when she's pulled out of the ship to when she gets taken up to the bridge. And really quickly, if this doesn't answer your question enough, because this is very specific, I'm happy to go more broadly afterwards. So this is a big chunk of the movie. I mean, well, this sequence is a fairly long sequence, and it goes across a huge chunk of the set. It's a massive set. It's an ocean liner in space. It's got multiple decks, multiple rooms, casts of thousands, right? And so we are going through all this stuff. And the storyboards are the starting point for everything we do. If you think of yourself as an architect, if you think of yourself as a builder, you're going to build a house. What the hell are you going to do if you don't have blueprints, right? The blueprints have not only the design of the house, they have all the engineering figured out, right? What every little piece has to be, how it has to be put together. So the storyboards are that for us. And we are not just making a spaceship to look cool. We're making a spaceship that can do everything it's doing in all these drawings. The characters have to go from here to here. This has to happen at this place. This has to have this feel. There's just a lot of stuff that we have to dissect and process from this. And then a part of the process, I'm just wondering if this is actually the best talk for your question, but I'm going to go with it. So there's a lot of figuring out rational scale, rational space. There's sort of figuring out things like what is the visual, how is each thing visually distinct? How does each thing kind of have a context that kind of explains what it is? That if it's an engineering room, if it's a docking bay, if it's a trash room, that it has that can read like that. And then visually, having enough visual variation. The production designer's job is to look at all these things and make sure that everything is visually distinctive, it's clear, it's aesthetically pleasing, it's telling the story. And there's a sense of, again, you have a sense of where you are. There's kind of a visual codification of things, a visual language that's established from place to place. That, again, you're not thinking of any individual piece, but you're thinking about everything, how they relate together as if like notes in a piece of music or as different instruments in a piece of music. They all have to be working together. one of the things, besides the fact that you have spatial issues you're solving for, story issues in terms of camera and staging and action, you're also trying to solve for emotion. And you can have a single space, a single set, that has radically different emotions. It has a happy scene, a sad scene, a funny scene. And a lot of the power of storytelling and Pixar films is about the emotion. And you can't like put characters in a set, and to make it happy, you put flowers in it, and then you go back to the set, 10 minutes later where someone's heart was broken and now all the plants are dead. I mean, that's contrived, right? People will see they're being manipulated. So you have to find subtle ways to craft emotion that's still respectful of the continuity of the world it's in. And this, to me, is one of my favorite examples of emotional storytelling in the same exact set, by simply changing camera, the composition, and by changing lighting. And I don't think they even really changed the dressing. I don't think they moved dressing around that much for these shots. So if you look here, this is Toy Story 3. The top left is this moment where they think they're all happy, they're all on vacation, it's going to be great. So you have this nice lighting, there's lots of warm and cool colors. It's a very tropical palette, because it's supposed to be like a resort. And then they realize that this is hell on earth. It's not a nice place. And now that same environment has got the sunset light where it's like Apocalypse Now, and it's like, and all the toys have been beaten, and they're coming to their senses, and there's like PTSD, and and then you've got a scene where they're imprisoned, and it's actually a little dark here on the screen, so you probably can't tell what's happening in the top left, but top right, but bottom right, it's the same environment, just a different camera composition, and the same preschool looks like a prison now. And what is it that makes it look like a prison? Yeah, the windows, the lighting. If you look out behind Buzz, what do you see? Gun tower, barbed wire, right? And it's just that little toy every preschool has, and it's a slide back there. And then you've got every preschool, at least in America, has these sort of cubbies with these little bins that hold toys. And again, it's just about creating an emotional statement through how you're lighting it, how you're composing it, how you're playing with shapes that evoke a thought. That in a certain combination can communicate a certain thought or a different connotation. So this is just an example of the emotional layer to things we have to think about. So this will touch a little bit on the story question. I think I may need to kind of come back to that after this talk. So being an artist in a narrative medium like animation, I think this also in some ways can apply to picture books. It could apply to comic books if you want. I think any kind of medium where you've got an image and you're trying to tell a story with the image, you're relating the two. So my job, I've come to learn, is basically how do I use images to tell a story. And now we have a lot of images already. There's already the first layer of interpretation from the story being a written word. The storyboard is the first layer of interpreting that written word into an image and into this sequential form. But it doesn't necessarily address, the storyboard artists don't really care about they don't care about the level of fidelity of how you feel about it or whatever. I mean, they do care about performance, they care about staging, but they're just communicating, again, the idea, the blocking, the story intent of that scene. When it goes to the art department, then we really have to start to think much more deeply about how do our designs help to create visual clarity, how do they lead the eye, how do they communicate emotion or idea. So this is a tool that we use. Well, I don't want to say this is a tool we use. This is a way of abstracting a relationship between story and image. I don't know anyone who actually approaches design with this in mind. This is almost more of like a way of analyzing and stepping back. So I think most of you are familiar with a dramatic arc. Yeah, so a dramatic arc is basically, it's time across the x-axis and y-axis is some value. In this case, it's a dramatic value. And what I've done here is I've done kind of a story graph of this sequence of Wall-E going through different parts of the ship. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to, actually, I take it back. This is more about the visual intensity. I have another one that's about the emotional arc, because you can, again, graph different things. So this one in particular is about kind of the visual intensity that Andrew Stanton, the director, wanted. The graph, the smaller graph on the left there, that's sort of the larger graph of the film. That's more of the dramatic arc of him. I can't even read that. I can't read it here either, so that's fine. You know, kind of like getting to what he wants and then losing it. I think what this is, he's alone on the left there. It starts to go up to that ski slope. That's basically him meeting Eve and falling in love with Eve, and he's finally not alone anymore. And then he loses Eve, and now life is worse than it was before, and about him gradually getting back to Eve and being happy. So his fulfillment, his desire, mapped from when it's low, he's away from that desire, and when it's up high, he's getting closer to it. So this other graph of the bumps here is pretty much this sequence, this series of scenes. And Andrew wanted to have a very particular emotion or visual journey that supported the emotional journey. And I will go through moving forward and explain what I mean by that. But what this does basically is it allows you to quantify something or to compare something. So in the left, and this is in the circle here, on the lower left, that's where the sequence starts, where he's in the loading bay, where the ship is pulled in and Eve is pulled out. And then he goes to, he's then with Eve in the elevator. I don't know if you can see those dotted vertical lines. And the next scene is he goes into the corridor where he sees the humans for the first time. The next section is he's in the larger economy class area where there's more humans. And so there's sort of like a visual intensity, visual and emotional intensity is climbing. And then you go to the main economy class, which is like the Times Square area of the ship. And then you go to the Lido, or the coach class. Then it comes down with the Lido deck, where it's much calmer, and then it goes back up to the bridge. So I'll explain what all of this means. I'll skip that. So really quickly, well, this is I'll do it real quick. This is a process of me thinking about, I have to design graphics for the ship. There's graphics on the walls, there's graphics on the robots, there are graphics in the holograms, there are graphics happening in people's screens, and again, all this stuff, it's not just there for its own sake, it's not there to look pretty, it's there to make the world believable, it's there to help tell the story. And so then I have to kind of figure out, how do I group these, how do I organize these and think about these, because there's thousands of graphics in this area. So this is the initial process of compartmentalizing them in terms of like different languages. We have the first parts of the ship where when Wally, I apologize, I feel like I'm going to be going back and forth a lot. There's there's 4 or 5 sections here that ended up having a visual grouping. There was the first sections when Wally lands on the ship. So I'm going to backpedal. The story is about Wally kind of sort of being human, or he's basically like a human. He's emotional. Humanity's gone. He's all alone, and it's kind of a sad story. He ends up meeting another robot and falling in love. And his longing throughout the beginning of the movie is that he's alone and he wants company. He fantasizes about humanity. He watches this videotape. Finally, someone is there, and she's cute, and she's white, and she's round, and she's got these little eyes that drive him crazy. This sequence is, she's taken away from him, and he wants her back. Yet, in a way, as he's going through this journey, a lot of his questions, a lot of his longing is being answered and presented to him that now is inconsequential in a way. Because all he wanted before was humanity. He wanted to be a part of humanity, or have company. So when he first lands, Eve is taken out, and there's other robots. They're cleaning her. That's astounding. He's not alone anymore. He could make friends with them, but he doesn't. He wants Eve. He wants to get Eve because he's fallen in love with her. And then he goes to a section where there's this corridor, and there's all these robots. There's a highway of robots going around. There's a world of robots. I needed to use the graphic design language in that environment to say this is a robot world, because Wally's understanding, and our understanding watching Wally, is that we're learning things step by step. So at this step, we think that he's now no longer alone. He's with all these robots in a robot world, but he kind of doesn't care anymore. He wants this one robot. And then he goes and he starts meeting the humans in this economy class section here. And this section was about showing Wally and showing the audience that this is humanity. Humanity had left the Earth, and here they are. And the graphics had to help tell the story of this is the world of B&L. This is the humanity that was sort of advertised in the world of all the B&L advertising on Earth. So then there's a next section where he goes into the Times Square giant part of the ship, which is completely overwhelming. This is not only is it the same humanity that left Earth, whatever, 10,000 years ago or however long ago it was, but they've now evolved and continued to grow and develop into this other, almost, species in a way. They've devolved, but that he's now effectively in another Earth. But again, he doesn't care because he wants Eve. And eventually, when we get to the bridge section, he's entering a world that's run by autopilot. Autopilot is the antagonist of the film. Autopilot controls everything. Autopilot is this sort of soulless programmed robot, which is the opposite of Wall-E. And Autopilot, as this sort of robot, this programming, has basically confined humanity and is in a way kind of deprogramming humanity to be completely dependent on the machines. Not by bad intention, it's just by its programming. And so that's where a lot of the conflict comes in the film. But we wanted to have a different kind of visual language and different visual intensity there. So again, each of these sort of moments has to communicate something different. The original thing I did was I decided to kind of come up with a design logic of how to relate all these things. And so the utility class would be something that was very machine-like. It would be instructional. It would be like this kind of caution signage, and it would be like numbers and arrows and things that you could kind of infer functionality from it, but it was done in a very sci-fi kind of visual language that, again, supports the idea when Wall-E first enters these robot spaces that it's just inhabited by robots and all the graphics are for robots. Then there's when he goes into the passenger section, which is now about humanity. Andrew this was a satirical film. He wanted to satirize the sort of de-evolution of humanity into becoming these sort of like consumer-driven, bottle-fed babies. Like being in space and in gravity for so long, their bones deteriorated. They became basically oversized infants in these like floating chairs, eating out of giant bottles like little kids. And so we wanted to come up with a visual language that was kind of commercial in nature, that was about advertising and consumerism, but also was kind of dumbed down for like big kids in a way. So it's like playful, soft, colorful. And then I proposed the idea of having kind of a visual language for the bridge and for autopilot. Autopilot controls the ship. No one knows how to control a ship. This has to be an alien language. It has to be like computer code. So we had these ideas, and I quickly put together a style guide of kind of communicating these ideas of the utility iconography and utility patterning. And this is just found reference, trying to come up with a voice, an identity, or a logic for these areas. Even the topography being machine-like but clear and legible. Going to the passenger section where it's more iconic and it's cute and it's super simple visual storytelling. And again, it's a very kind of shiny, flashy, attention-getting colors and very appealing and kind of bubbly, cute letter forms. We had this whole idea that humans were kind of almost illiterate and that we would have these abstracted letter forms, but that got a little overly intellectual. And then the kind of bridge language, again, the iconography, you don't know what any of these things do. It's almost like code. And then kind of the complexity of pattern and topography. And then kind of mushing it together to kind of say, here's our spectrum. Here's our visual journey. And that was followed by kind of coming up with a very complicated system for being able to design motion graphics on the bridge and elsewhere in the ship that would give our director maximum flexibility to change his mind later, because he often would change his mind once he saw how things were coming together. So it all got approved, and then the next week got unapproved because the story changed. But basically, we still more or less stuck to the logic. And so designing a lot of graphics and things for the utility section, We didn't have the time to do what we usually did, which was to basically, I would design every single shot, and give direction for every shot. Instead, it was like, here's a bunch of stickers, you guys go put them on, and then I'll take a look at it and make sure it's not like distracting or breaking some visual rule. The holograms was a nightmare in many ways just because of all the moving parts. I won't go into too much detail. This is some of the art process. There's a lot of reference and research. In this case, I wanted to come up, I love the vintage travel posters because back then with that style, it was a very simple style, very graphic, but also a maximum economy of storytelling. You notice how all these things are cropped. A lot of the figures are cropped in a way where you're getting maybe 40% of a figure or something doing something, but you know exactly what they're doing. So I like that visual shorthand and also the kind of simplification of graphic forms on the Olympic stuff. And then we would draw and just iterate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of versions of these things. And then we kind of came up with a visual language. So this was a visual language for the when Wall-E first is introduced to humans, and we needed to establish that these are the same humans from Earth. They don't look like the same humans. Like, to the audience, we've never seen them before. They're sort of these weird blobby fat people in chairs. They could be aliens for all we know. But by really trying to say, here's B&L, here's all the branding we saw on Earth, we can begin to infer these are the same people. And so we really needed to keep the B&L branding very simple, very recognizable, that all these things together had to have an overall gestalt. Like, it just had to read the same thing, even though there's variety within them. And then we wanted there to be a lot of visual interest from the motion, but we also wanted the next sequence to be the biggest, most compelling visual moment, so it couldn't be too busy. So we had a lot of very simple motion that was very lateral, things sliding, a little bit of in and out, but very simple movement, very limited colors. And then the next moment was that Times Square moment. I feel like all of Pixar's movies have a Times Square moment. And maybe it's because I just worked on all of them. But this was more about, we wanted to get into this sort of satire, we wanted to get into this world that was consumer-driven, that they're constantly being advertised, these products, and the products keep changing, but they're all just reskins of the exact same thing. It's like, it's always like food in a cup, it's just a different flavor. It's always the same uniform, it's just a different color. So we just wanted to be kind of a little funny, a little clever, a little satirical, and kind of communicating what the society was and how they needed help. They needed to grow up. They needed to get out of the cycle, this programmed, perpetuating cycle that was holding them back. And the irony of the story is that it takes Wall-E to come as a robot to come and teach humanity how to be human again. So then, this won't play, yeah. So we had a lot more busy, crazy motion on those. Going to this section, this section was like the last part of the ship, and it's actually what Andrew wanted was that we would build up this visual complexity of Wall-E being completely overwhelmed, visually, kind of emotionally, and then we wanted to get to the bridge, which was sort of introducing the bad guy. It was kicking off the plot. It had to do a lot of work, and so he wanted to give the audience a chance to kind of reset, to kind of cleanse their palate. Because when you're doing music, when you're writing, when you're trying to create any kind of crafting an experience, an emotional experience, you can't keep ratcheting it up because people will get bored. They'll lose interest. They'll get numb. It's like a roller coaster. How many of you have been on a roller coaster that only goes down? Probably not many, right? What's fun about a roller coaster is you go from this to that, up and down. And same with music. So visually, it's also the same thing because the story's doing this and the visuals need to do that, and they need to do kind of in tandem. So this was an opportunity to create a visual design language. There was no animation, very subdued pastels, very soft. You could probably recognize some of the shapes and cropping from the reference we had. And then that kind of cleansed the palette, and there was a moment of kind of repose, and then we go into the bridge, and then we go into all this sort of graphics design that's still that same circular kind of cartoony language, but it's very complicated and abstract and not intuitive. And then you can kind of see here how these things, how the theory was applied, or how the boards were interpreted and the logic was applied. And in giving that presentation, I'm realizing I probably did not answer your question at all about story, but I will say that so in animation, there's sort of two, again, the areas for interpretation, the storyboarding, which is basically, you can take an idea, you can write it down, he went to the woods, Like, what does that mean? So in writing, you know, you have to be visual. And so that's, but here, the storyboarders do a lot more of that. How did he get to the woods? Are we seeing him looking down where he's against the ground and really small? Are we seeing him close up where he's really big? Are we looking up and seeing the trees overhead? All of those things can convey different kinds of meaning, emotionally, about character, what have you. So there's an initial level of thought there. And then when it comes to art, there's, again, a much more sort of higher fidelity thought about how can we really crank those knobs even more in a way that's not contrived, it's not manipulative. It can hopefully, again, you know, not only does it create a pretty image or an interesting image, but it, again, it works to support that story intent. I'm trying to think if there's something else. Yeah, I don't know. You tell me. Do any questions still? Do you still have, are you left with any questions still?
You explained quite a lot, but basically my amazement when I look at Pixar films is the amount of like detail and how everything sort of supports the story.
Yeah.
And I can imagine because it's a big organization.
Yes.
So it must be quite a difficult. I'm interested in how do you manage to get like everybody going on the same way, especially if the working process is sort of crazy that you go one way and you go back and
Yep.
so forth. So I imagine like there probably, as you said, there isn't like a script as such, but it's like a process that keeps on developing.
Yes. Yeah.
You have a few more words about
Yeah. Maybe. I'm going to go into this other talk a little bit. So ultimately, it's the director that gives the high-level direction. He's in a way like the writer. I want a scene of a guy going from here to here, and I want the audience to feel this way, or you know, we are sympathetic to the character up to this point, then we're not, what have you. How we get there, some directors are very clear in how they want to do that because they see it in their head. And then that pretty much, you just then execute that to the best of your ability. Other directors don't know or don't care maybe so much how that happens. And that leaves room, I think, for the sort of subordinate leadership going down the pipe to begin to try to provide direction for them, help them find a meaningful way or a better way of doing it, or challenge them. The production designer is the person who's responsible for all the visuals in the movie. And as these movies are predominantly visual, that's a lot of it. And the production designer is the one who is being the first one to really take the storyboards and take the director's intention and then begin to do paintings and drawings that they feel like begins to really, that can effectively communicate that through image. And that's a lot of work. And they are communicating that image. They're having it validated by the director. The director says, yes, that's great, or the director says, no, you're missing the point, it should be this instead. But then the production designer has to basically, with the director, communicate that to 400 people on a production, or however many it is, over the next 4, 5, 6 years. So one of the tools that the production designer uses, so there's kind of like there's an order, a higher order sequencing kind of thing you do, where you try to solve the big problems first, and then, so like the director has the big problems, production designer has a layer of problems below that, and then the art directors have below that sort of a next level of detail to support the production designer. And then but it's not just a vertical thing, it's also horizontal, so that as you're designing characters, let's say, you're also involving animation, you're also involving modeling to also in some ways inform the design. Because it might be, you could design it a different way where it gives animation much more ability to create the performance that will communicate the emotion. So it's definitely like, it's almost like a military thing. You've got the general on top, and actually I don't know all the ranks, but I mean, it goes all the way down to the grunts. And the better that sometimes when that is really clear, like some directors are very clear, it actually makes everything go very smoothly. It's great. And it's never always clear, but some directors, like, it's a process of discovery where they don't know what they want, they have to kind of find it. And then it's a lot more of like everyone trying things, and it's like you're in the water and you're being pushed around by different currents, you know. Maybe I can walk you through a little bit of Lifted was a film I production designed, that it can at least maybe give you a clear example of, as a production designer, how I would think, and then how that would be then communicated. So this starts with a director having an idea. So Gary, are you familiar with Lifted? Okay, and someone keep track of time for me, because otherwise we'll be here for like 5 days. So Gary was a first-time director. So Gary Rydstrom, for those of you who don't know, is one of Hollywood's most celebrated sound designers. He's worked on a couple of movies you maybe have heard of. That's just a few of them. I think he's tied for the most Academy Award nominations of anyone in Hollywood. I forgot who he's tied with. Yeah, this is his bathroom. And he was given an opportunity, because he'd done the sound design on all of Pixar's films, in addition to Spielberg and Lucas and Coppola and whoever else, everyone else, Cameron. But he like me, he wanted to be a storyteller, and he wanted to, and John Lasseter gave him an opportunity. He said, why don't you direct a short for us? And a short is sort of like in theory, a kind of a training ground for directors. It's because the thought is, if you can direct a short, you can direct a feature. And it's also a training opportunity for people like me at the time, where I had been there a long time, I had a lot of experience, but I was sort of in the lower trenches of sort of limiting my problem solving to, again, more specific things. And it was a chance for me to step up and begin to think much larger. And at some level, it was an opportunity to kind of R&D, maybe new technology. And also, it was Oscar bait. Oscar bait. So they wanted to get more Oscars, and so the shorts were always going to be nominated, and they wanted to win them. Because Pixar, they don't want to be known as just a commercial company. They want to be known also as an artistic company, and shorts are not commercial. You don't make money off of shorts, but it can help to, in some ways, push the artistic merits of the medium. So Gary, being a sound designer, that was his office. And that soundboard probably extends another few more feet off camera. And in his experience, he would have directors come in there, and they would just sit next to him and look at this massive console and go, oh my, how do you use this thing? This is incomprehensible. Like, what do you even do? And to Gary, it was very, very simple. It was a very simple logic to it, but he was always amused by how people would kind of freak out when they saw this thing, because it just seemed, again, incomprehensible. But the flip side of that also is he would have these people, these directors sitting next to him, judging everything he does. And he almost started to feel like a student, like if James Cameron's there and he's like pissed off about something or whatever, and he's like, oh, I want to make him happy. And so there's sort of these experiences he had that he wanted to try and translate into a film. And it kind of also reminded him of like, being a student, and you're taking your driver's test, and there's nothing worse than you're driving and you got someone judging every turn you make. So he liked the idea also of how do you take that experience and how do you maybe frame it in a way that you can have this dramatic contrast? Like, what if it was something really serious? And obviously he was a huge fan of Close Encounters. And so he thought, well, why don't we do kind of like a Close Encounters? You've got someone who's like a pilot or having to like kidnap a farmer, because we're in America, this is sort of a part of our mythology and the whole UFO thing and abducting farmers. I don't know where it comes from, but whatever. And so how can he combine kind of the serious drama with this kind of goofy student kind of screwing up? And he was also a fan of old movies, old cartoons, and he wanted to have this kind of, he loved the elasticity of this kind of stuff, these extremes of expression and behavior. So then, and he also loved kind of contrasts in relationship, especially contrast is funny. If you go from one thing to something radically different, there's sometimes can be kind of a comedic moment in that transition between, and even relationships. Like he loved Laurel and Hardy, and you've got Laurel, Hardy's the big guy, right? Laurel, I think so. You guys don't know? Someone here must know.
We don't use those names.
Oh, that's awesome. What are they called? Wow, that's sweet. Okay. So anyway, so the big guy is the serious, straight guy, and and the little guy is like kind of goofy and nervous and fidgety, and so he loved that relationship. So then the last thing that kind of informed like the gestation of the idea for the short was, Andrew Stanton came up to him and said, "Hey, Gary, I'm making a movie, and it's going to be about this alien race in space, in this big spaceship, with this robot that has to come in and save them. And all these aliens are green, and they're transparent. Can you make your alien green and transparent so we can use your tech for our film?" It was a part of that R&D idea. And Gary's like, "Sure, that's fine." And ironically, the story changed, and it was humanity now, and there was no green aliens. But Gary was still stuck having to develop that for his film. So in essence, you have a situation where you've got the formula for comedy, or the formula for our short film, and then the obvious answer to us was that. And no, I'm serious. So this is our process of figuring out stuff. So we get green goop and green material and start playing with it and thinking about what can you do as a character. Do you guys have these things? These are called water weenies in our country. It's like a squishy green thing. Yeah. So that was the idea. And then again, the starting point for it was the story reel. Which is this. So this is the movie, the state of the movie when I was brought on. This happens all the time in America. So that's Gary's explanation for where crop circles come from bad tests. So some of this stuff I'm going to cut through maybe a little quickly, just to kind of cover other topics. These are his first drawings, and the first thing that happens with story is really about character, and these are character-driven stories. And so, to me, story is sort of like, oh well, let me think. You have a character in a situation, and how that character naturally responds to that situation is sort of where the story comes from. And plot is often sort of about a character in a situation wanting something, and the things that maybe get in the way of what they want is kind of plot. So, the first thing was to kind of figure out this character. And so the main character, his name is Stu. You guys know why he's named Stu? Which is a, kind of semi-common name. No guesses? It's clever. It's short for student. Yeah, I make a note. So our student is this nerdy, goofy kid who bears an uncanny resemblance to me when I was younger. And he also liked the idea of kind of like a Mr. Bean, really elastic kind of comedic character. These are the storyboard drawings, and again, the character has he has like a rubber face. He has a lot of extreme, almost old Warner Brothers style expressions. And then you would go through this long character development phase of different artists trying different interpretations on the character, and you're trying both characters. You're thinking about them in relationship to each other. How do they complement each other? How do they contrast? How do they relate? And then it goes into kind of a refinement phase with another artist kind of tying it all together and sort of figuring out the details, fleshing it out, exploring like how might the character emote differently based on these properties. What are some of the key poses he might have? And then every major design at Pixar, it doesn't just go from paper to the computer, because there's a massive gap between seeing something drawn on a piece of paper. Even if it's turned around, it's still kind of a cheat, because we don't think or draw three-dimensionally. And in the computer, sometimes it can take a lot of time and a lot of work to get in the computer, to refine in the computer, to iterate in the computer. The hardware is expensive, the software is expensive, the people using it are expensive. It's often, so there's a middle ground between getting the drawings you like and then testing it in 3D before you even go to the computer, and that's called the maquette. So this is clay, and clay is something you can work quickly in. So our sculptors will always take the character designs, interpret the character, find it in clay. The director can then take that thing, and much more easily than in CG. Even in CG, you're still looking at a flat representation of 3D, right? It's not like you could pick up the model and turn it around. And you might have, depending on the resolution of the software or how it's rendering, sometimes it's hard to really understand the form. With a sculpt, you can pick it up and turn it around in the light, look at it from different angles, and really, really understand that form. Then once the sculpt is approved, if there's changes in the sculpt, you go back, you change the drawings, and then the sculpt and the drawings go to the 3D team to now build it, where it's already been validated. And it's much easier for them to interpret the clay model or kind of double check the intention of the drawing with the intention of the sculpt, and there's a lot less guesswork for them. They can be on target and get it done more quickly. And there's all the detail work, like what is Stu's, how many teeth does he have? How does his elbow bend? How many folds are in the skin? How does the antenna attach to the helmet? Like lots of little details. And sometimes a character could have 20 pages of drawings. The model packet I did for Mike was like probably a good 20 pages or so. Sometimes it could take months to get the design, years even for some characters. And some characters like this guy, are just pretty much one drawing covers it, is done, goes to sculpt, and then you detail it out. And then the third character, when you're on a short, you don't have the budget of a feature, you don't have the crew of a feature, so you really sometimes have to be clever. So we spent all of our money really on the aliens, and so for the farmer, the guy who's kidnapped, who's more of like a prop really, he's not a character, I don't know if you guys recognize him. You know who that is? That's Luigi from Ratatouille. Yeah. So we drugged him up for this movie. We drugged him and dressed him up. And then you're even figuring out like what's the pajamas and pattern, and I must have done 100 different plaid designs before we got the right one. So where I got more involved, basically that's where things were when I came on, and then up to this point, it's figuring out the materials of things. I won't go into much detail, but there's a lot of reference. The original look of the character was too flat, too synthetic. I wanted it to feel more organic, so I got more into a lot of different layers of skin and different layers of translucency and different areas of volumetric density and bubbles and wanting refraction and all that stuff. And there's some great stories about this, but we'll skip it. And then there was, like, again, all the different components of how do you realize the character from a material standpoint. And there's a lot of complexity went into this, and there's a lot of tests, and how does it look, various stages, how does it behave, you put it all together, so that's, that process. So the real production design process, though, for me was how do I take the story that goes from serious close encounters moment, or serious pastoral American night, farmhouse, man sleeping, you don't know what to expect, it's calm, it's quiet, and then bang, close encounters, lights, drama, intensity, and then that bump, that first bump, and you realize, oh wait, this isn't serious, is it? And then you go to the alien in the ship, and now it's a totally comedic moment, and the rest of that moment is about going back and forth between this banal, kind of mundane, Department of Motor Vehicles driver's training test of a student taking a test with a teacher with a clipboard to the serious, overly dramatic alien abduction. And the more you go back and forth between them, the kind of the funnier it gets. So for me, this was really a study in contrasts. And so, because the contrast is already there, so I just thought, okay, well, how do I use the visuals to really help take that contrast and just crank it up a notch? And then the other part of what I'm doing too is I'm thinking about we just have all this stuff in the movie. It all has to look like something. What should it look like? So it should look like something that, again, either doesn't get in the way of the story or it supports the story. So I have to now scope and go, okay, what are the locations? We have the outside the house. We have multiple shots outside the house, multiple angles. We've got a windmill, we've got a tree, we've got the cornfields, we've got inside the house, there's a bed, there's a nightstand, there's a window. His butt has to fit through the window. I got to make sure that can happen. If I design the window too small and his butt can't fit through, that doesn't do the story any good. And then and the ship and all of that. So taking Gary's touch points again, contrast, comedic contrast. And so this stuff, we were basically doing a parody, or satire, or I guess a parody of serious alien abduction. So it only would work if we hit this seriously, and we did it in a way that people recognize it. So when you see that blue light goes on, you know it's a UFO, because all of our movies have that same blue light, because Spielberg used it in Close Encounters. And so it's become a part of our unconscious visual language. So that was sort of like the first stake in the ground. I didn't want to change that, because if I changed the kind of lighting and colors and stuff, you wouldn't right away know what was going on. It could be a train outside, it could be a plane outside, who knows, right? So this is a starting point for me, and then now I'm thinking from a story standpoint, how do I now build that contrast away from that? How do I maximize contrast away from that? So first thing I do is kind of a color script, a very loose color script. So the color script for us is a tool for, it's like if you think, it's almost like a picture book, like a kid's picture book, where you take these different scenes or sequences from the movie, and you're thinking about how does the color and light or various other factors, it can include shape, it can include composition, how do various factors serve each scene, but more importantly, how do all the scenes work together, and what is the kind of that graph, visual graph, and how does it support the graph of story? So this is me saying, okay, we want generic Close Encounters lighting, and then, so it's high key lighting, high contrast. You have stuff that's either white and black, and then a very narrow mid-range of blue, but most details getting blown out. Before that, you've got the farmhouse, so it's very naturalistic. It's instead of blues, instead of it being a blue night, we made it a little warmer, or maybe a little greener or something, so that I didn't have a lot of blue in the night. I didn't have a lot of any blue light in the house. It was all very warm, so that when you go to the blue light, there's like a real contrast. And then when you go to the ship, it's very low contrast, very low-key lighting. It's ambient. It's like fluorescent lighting. And you go from a cramped space and natural materials to a wide space and man-made materials. And I really wanted to evoke kind of like a driver's car, like or a classroom, or like an old 50s classroom. And so we use a lot of grays and metals and materials that felt kind of alien, felt kind of high-tech, but they were also very grounded, very earthly, and something maybe you kind of unconsciously associate with your time in school at some point, if you're older. And then there's sort of an intermingling of how do we bring in the dramatic lighting into the undramatic lighting, but then also bring in warmth, because the whole movie is so cool. I wanted to have a warm light at the end that was tied to his success, when he thinks he'll be succeeding. So anyways, there's some initial thoughts there, and I'm just basically painting over the storyboards. So going through the process was a lot of research. Like we have a very American touchstone, so like we want to evoke the sort of classic painter. We want to evoke the sort of, shaker, kind of early American kind of architecture and the iconic farmhouse. So there's a lot of sketching and trying to figure out, like, again, the details and stuff. A lot of previs. We do previs. It's kind of like the same thing as like the clay sculpt, but we do it in the computer. Sometimes people will previs with like foam core, or make, like when I did the Bugs Life thing with a little paper can, that was sort of prevising it in 3D, but with paper. But here we'll do it in CG. And again, what you're doing mainly is just to make sure that these initial assumptions you're making, you're kind of sketching it out, making sure that you can get the camera shots you need, that it's still telling the story. You can see him on the floor with his butt in the window, and he can come through the window, and you're getting the compositions you need. And then once that's all confirmed, then you go into detailing out, and doing the designs. And this is like reusing a tree from another movie, but trying to fill it out, figuring out the logistics of things. Going into modeling, and kind of just sort of, again, starting to solve more layers of detail and figuring out materials. There's every little detail has to be figured out. How much wear and tear is there on the bed frame? Is it glossy? Is it dull? Is it partly glossy, partly dull? Is it dark wood, light wood? I did 20 different quilts. You're just constantly trying things and iterating, experimenting. Like, how do you get it to be where it's busy and interesting and complex, but not too busy and too complex? How does it, how do you make it sort of caricatured and iconic and readable quickly? And then also, like, even the shape language of things. How do you create stuff like, we're not creating movies, this is still animation, but we want this opening sequence at least to feel very naturalistic, to feel like, almost like you're watching a movie, until the comedic shift. But we still wanted to have a little bit of animation style, but in the dark, with the lighting, it still felt naturalistic enough. It wasn't betraying the tone of that scene, which we wanted to feel kind of serious. So anyway, and then figuring out lighting and materials. For me, the ship was really about him. Gary was pretty clear from the get-go, the general layout of the ship, a round ship with him in the middle with this console. So I was trying to figure out within that space, how do I again bring in visuals to help with the storytelling or help with the emotion? And to me, this kid is being judged. He's like in the middle of a spotlight. He cannot hide behind anything. Everything he's doing is being watched by this guy kind of behind his shoulder. And you should feel like it's just like, again, you're in the spotlight. You're constantly being judged. I thought maybe there's even like a giant orb over him, like a giant light fixture that's almost like a giant eyeball looking at him. Or maybe it was like a giant weight that could kind of like crush him. And then I also thought, well, maybe if there's like these architectural beams or struts in the ship, they could almost be like arrows where they could be pointing, no matter where the character is in the frame, you would always have these arrows literally pointing at him, as though it's like, again, like everything is scrutinizing him. And some of the stuff we were able to pull off, and some of it we couldn't because the space, the scale of the space, and the lenses we were using on the cameras didn't always allow. Like this, again, this is faked for 2D. I can make it look good for the drawing, but in reality, things didn't always work that way. And I just also wanted to really evoke the learning how to drive and the classes you take and this road signage and stuff. So I was trying to find little ways to subtly bring in this language to kind of evoke a feeling of taking a driver's test without being explicit. And then, figuring out the space and the details and exploring ideas and exploring the console and even like the knobs, what do the knobs look like? Testing out the previous model, can we get the shots we need? How big does it need to be? I wanted it to be like a hubcap kind of too, and how big is it to the house? What do the effects look like? Materials, all that kind of stuff. Figuring out the scales, the actual sizes for things. So anyway, lots of information. And again, supplemental stuff. You know, this kind of material goes here, that kind of material goes here, and so forth. And then that was, you know, again, the inspiration for the console. And then yeah, just sort of seeing the pieces come together, the color materials coming together. I guess some of these slides were out of order. That was sort of like my 1950s driver's training console. And then, you know, even like having to solve for the crater. Eventually, the story changed, and the ship hits the house and creates a crater, and we needed to kind of design the crater and imply that the house had gotten compacted. And we even, I don't know if you can tell, we even had shoved a bunch of things in the compaction layer. There was like Mater is in there. We have some Finding Nemo characters in there. Someone's head is in there. Yeah, we get bored. So even like the props. And a couple of details I love here, like these are sort of embarrassing details. You could tell I'm a nerd, an art nerd. But one of the things I insisted on, which is a detail that no one will probably have ever noticed or have cared about, but for me, I just thought it just added that last tiny bit of believability to this world. So I actually had them put his greasy fingerprints all over the clipboard. So when he moves it in the light, you can see how the light reacts differently on the fingerprints. So it just gives you a feeling his hand is kind of greasy. And even on the chair, one of the chairs, there's like a patch on one of the leather backs. Again, it's like little subtle storytelling, trying to make the world believable. And then there's a lot of, again, lighting studies. How do we have kind of a controlled palette, and how do we maximize contrast to the blues, to the warms? And then I did a color script of lighting keys, where I would just paint over the layout shots. And again, just saying every shot, here's how every shot should look. So the lighters have clear directions. Here's an example of like the layout, and then my painting, and then the final execution. And this is my first time doing any of this stuff. It was a lot of fun. Very challenging, but a lot of fun. And even things like I had to design the visual effects, and you know, the hologram actually has emotion that's tied to his emotion. When he's angry, the hologram gets angry and kind of like buzzes and flickers. And when he's happy, the hologram's kind of calm and has like a low-level static. I did a lot of matte painting. There were a lot of shots we didn't have time to light, so we would just, if it was a locked shot, then I could just paint the lighting into it because it was a lot faster. This is a progression reel, so like from storyboard to layout. Very inspiring. You're looking at this for like a long time before you see any animation, so it's really hard not to lose faith. Then you start seeing the animation and you feel so much better. And then eventually you see it all put together. Do you guys want to see it? Okay. Are we doing good on time? Okay. All right, let's just skip to this. Stop. Wait. That's right. Boop. Wait, go back. Okay. And you'll notice some changes to it. All in all, it didn't change that much. And I'm going to sit down. I've seen this before. How many of you recognize that voice? So the other thing, too, that helps with the communication is really you have all these departments. On a short like this, it was pretty easy because you'd have maybe a handful of people in each department, a handful of animators, a handful of modelers. So you could communicate one-on-one. It was manageable. If you're in a screening room looking at footage, you might have 20 people in there, all at once. It was a little overwhelming at times. But on a feature, you've got multiple departments that could have 20, 50, more people. So you have department leads. You've got supervisors and leaders. You've got managers and, again, a variety of people at different levels that, again, help to carry the burden of communication. So it's definitely a huge collaborative project, and Pixar has a pretty robust structure for, they've been doing it long enough. They know how to manage that, and they know how important a consistent message is. But any other questions, you guys?
Thanks. Yeah, so we have know a lot about this filming artist. I wonder what's the difference between being a game artist and a filming artist?
Well, all right. You guys already know this whole my talk, right? So you're just leading me on. So the biggest difference. How many of you are interested in going into the game? Because it'll probably take up the rest of the time, and versus film type stuff. That's okay. I'll talk about the game. Maybe I won't go through it as much. Or I can, for those who raise your hands and you're interested in games, ask me specific questions and I can dive into specific answers. But the biggest difference, I think, between working on a film and working on a game, especially like as an art director, is on the narrative. In a way, it's almost an easier. It's a different set of problems. So you're solving for a story, right? A story is a pre-existing structure, a pre-existing roadmap, and that you are using, again, different tools to try to express that through a certain medium. Doing the same thing in games is usually you're not doing a story, unless it's a story game, in which case it abides by many of the same rules. But if you're doing more of like, say, a sandbox game or most games where the player isn't following a story, you're going in and you're, like in Counter-Spy, you're going in and you're shooting things and you're blowing things up and you're going into different levels to you're earning points or you're collecting power-ups or whatever, right? It's more experiential. It's more, sometimes it's visceral. Sometimes there's puzzling. There's different mechanics in play, right? So you're using design to create a framework. You're using it more to create visuals and things to make the game look cool and maintain interests and give a visual range so that as you progress through a game, you don't get bored. It becomes more visually rewarding, maybe. In the case of Counter-Spy, we were trying to build a fiction. It was a 1960s Cold War environment. You were in these sort of underground bunkers of like sort of pseudo-Soviet, pseudo-US kinds of military installations. You're collecting intelligence. We were trying to evoke a time and a place. We were trying to caricature it. I was trying to create a fiction. It's a spy game. It's a Cold War sort of spy game. And so I wanted to create that fiction where you, it's a fantasy. It's like in a game, you're often trying to go into a certain fantasy, whether it's a first-person shooter. You could be doing the Wolfenstein kind of Germany thing. You could be doing a fantasy game. It's more of a Lord of the Rings type of experience. It could be a horror game, right? You're always trying to capture a fantasy and create an environment or a framework that the player can go within that world and experience it. And you're trying to keep them engaged through the hours of gameplay. And usually it's mapped to some level of progression or difficulty or whatever, right? It has various different sets of rules. So for me, at least for Counter-Spy, it was more about, I was focused on creating an aesthetic, creating an original kind of look and voice, communicating story visually, making the space feel, the fantasy and the fiction feel kind of consistent and believable. But again, my games experience in this capacity is fairly limited, so I probably can't give you a much more robust answer than that.
Could you tell us more about storytelling in VR? Like what kind of
yeah.
challenges you've
Sure.
had and how different it is to tell stories in VR compared to other media you have previously worked
Yeah,
with?
that's a great question. So there's an interesting leap between obviously narrative and games because again, narrative it's a carefully constructed journey. The storyteller has a specific, any story has a specific journey to it. And again, games is you're creating more of a space of potential. You're creating a framework that people can project their imagination into, but then you're giving them freedom to do what they want in that space. VR is very much more, well, depending on the VR experience, because you do have narrative experiences in VR, which are super challenging, because when you're telling a story, if I'm telling you a story right now, at least, you're looking at me, and I've got your attention, and if you're watching a movie, the story is right there, it's being given to you. In VR, it's kind of like, it could be, you have the whole, you want to look at everything. Right now, there's such a novelty to VR too, when people put it on, they just want to do this and look around. And if you're trying to tell a story in VR, it's kind of like trying to talk to someone who has like ADHD or something, or someone who can't listen to you, right? No, talk to me, I'm over here, right? So there's a challenge in VR from a narrative standpoint where you want to give people, VR is about freedom. You're in a world even more than in a game world. It's more immersive, and there's this instinct to want to explore that world. But then as a storyteller, you wanting to command attention, and if they're not looking at your story, how do you deal with that? And I can go into much more of that. There's some good case studies I can talk about. From a game standpoint, depending on the game, so the game, I was art directing a game that had a few challenges. So one, it was a sort of, the game mechanic, the type of game itself was almost more of like a tabletop kind of top-down game in a way, where like you're moving your pieces and you're strategically attacking each other and that kind of thing. But we wanted to take advantage of VR and make it immersive, where you're in the battlefield and your little dudes are actually this tall around you, and there's shells going off over your head. And so there's a massive cognitive leap between you as a player having an abstraction of having your core fantasy is kind of in front of you, and it's like it could be a Western, it could be fantasy, it could be sci-fi, whatever. But it's it's like you're projecting a lot of your imagination, but really it's about the strategic decisions you're making. So there was a big challenge between how do we enable that kind of high-level tactical combat, but letting you be in the world and see it as though it was a real battle, like you're in Saving Private Ryan. And so that was interesting. The advantage we had is because of the sort of, it was more of a turn-taking nature. People could afford to look around without losing the game. If you take a more conventional game like a first-person shooter kind of thing, that lends itself very well in some ways in terms of how you're used to experiencing the environment. But in VR, there's different problems to solve for than, say, a traditional first-person shooter, because it's still, for the user, when you're in VR, and if you are doing the full, not just the 360 VR, but the spatial VR, you're adding a lot of processing for the brain. It's tiring. There's a lot you're taking in. If you introduce any kind of, if you have any disagreement between sort of head movement and body movement, or the world moving, it induces nausea. The virtual reality is so close to real reality, but anywhere that it's off, the brain gets confused and the inner ear gets confused. So there's a lot of challenges, and you have to be very constricted in certain things, like you can't be moving in the world and be looking around at the same time often, or things like that. Some of the challenges I found, which were surprising to me, was that I wanted to build this gigantic epic world you're in. Like I wanted to feel palatial, because it's a fantasy, right? And you got these big dudes there. But the thing is once we built it all and it looked impressive, it was beautiful art, and you go and put on the helmet, suddenly you felt like a little toy, like in a regular sized room. Like the world didn't feel big, you just felt small. And so there's a learning curve in terms of having a rational scale and having scale cues. Like we had to put things in that were at a human size in the world, like maybe human-sized doors, or a line that would be roughly where like a handrail might be, which in your mind begins to think that feels like a handrail, or that feels like the height from the floor I would expect. And then that then began to make the rest of the world look bigger. Because also with depth, you can't always tell how far things are from you. And so you have to have a lot of micro detail to help sell scale. Another thing I found interesting was that we wanted, because you can design everything in the space, it became very distracting to the player often, because now they can take in all the stuff, wow, but they're not playing the game, or they're getting shot or whatever. It's distracting to the experience. And also it's just tiring, because you got this big dumb pot on your head, and it's just, and certain games I've seen, you constantly are, like, they really want to take advantage of the full spectrum, but you're constantly having to work and look at things. Or one thing they did at one point was they put the UI behind you, so you have to keep turning around, look at the UI, turn back around and do this. It was exhausting. And so again, how do you economize for compacting the important visual information in a certain spatial range, and kind of where things are in your peripheral vision? You don't have to look too far out to get what you need to distract you from the core experience. How do you still give enough detail to that stuff out there where it's interesting, but in a way that doesn't compete? There were some other challenges we faced. What were they? Yeah, off the top of my head. It was really just, I think the scale stuff was interesting to me. And no matter, I'd always make things way too big. Once they were back in VR, I'd always have to shrink them back down. Or again, build in certain kind of cues that would help compensate. Yeah, in the narrative side, I know that Google, you've got Google Spotlight Stories, you've got Oculus Story Group, or had, you've got Baobab and a bunch of other studios that are experimenting with the early narrative filmmaking, storytelling. But they're all facing the same problems. They're all trying different solutions, because there's a difference. There's, again, an innate conflict between a constructed narrative story you're supposed to follow, and the freedom of the immersion in the world. And then also, how do you create that agency where you can affect the story, because the story is often told to you. It's not something, if the story is happening in front of you and you feel like you're in that world, you should be able to touch it and interact with it. There's the brain kind of expects certain things. And so I think they're still trying to find ways to maximize your ability to, how can they craft a story that you can follow? How can they do it in a way where you feel like you're a part of it? Or if you want to, because not all of them do that. But like, if you guys, I don't know if you're familiar with the Spotlight Stories that Google put out on, do you guys have Android devices here? If you do, the Android store has all their films. They're free, and they're all short film. There's 6 or 7 short films they did. They're all in VR, the 360 VR. And they're just interesting lessons in the first stages of this new artistic medium of VR storytelling. And I think that each of them is historic, because each one tries something, and you can kind of see where it's kind of cool, but where it doesn't work. And the next one where they tried something different, it's kind of interesting, and it kind of works and kind of doesn't. And each one is like a baby step to creating a new grammar. And it's the same that all these other companies are trying their own things at it. So it's really, if you think about like the history of movies, and the first movies that came out were not 2-hour long. It wasn't the Avengers back then. It was like these weird little short films of people experimenting. They often didn't even have stories, or maybe it was just like the famous one of the great train robbery, the train coming through the screen and people panicking and jumping out of their seats. A lot of the VR stuff you're seeing now, both games and movies, are those kinds of early explorations with a new medium. And I think it's going to be a while before they fully mature and you find kind of a grammar and a language that takes the best of what's in VR, and you can only experience that in VR. So right now there's a lot of like narrative things that kind of work and kind of don't, and games that kind of work, kind of don't, But so hopefully some of you guys will be helping to solve that, because this is kind of a golden age right now for new kinds of content. You've had your hand up for a while, so.
Hi, I'm a set designer student, and I'm interested in the world building you had. You mentioned that you had that in the Counter-Spy.
Yes. Okay.
Can you say anything about it? How you will build
the
world?
That's good. I can. How many of you are familiar with Counter-Spy? A few of you. Okay, so we'll just play this. There's lots of shooting. So set design for a game is, thank you, is a little different than obviously for a movie. I actually have a set design breakdown from Incredibles, which I don't know if it's a better one for you. Are you more interested in narrative or more on the game side?
Doesn't matter, I don't know.
Okay. I will try to go super quickly through this. So let me skip through some of this stuff. Blah, 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 blah. Talk. Pictures. Okay. So the in this game in particular, they wanted a side-scrolling game, and I sort of kind of convinced them to go into 3D because they were using Unity, which is a 3D engine. They wanted it to be a flat side-scrolling game. I wanted to play with. I like parallax and I like depth, and I felt like you could still do it in a stylized way. So I began to kind of push them from this. This is the first painting I did of a background to then I went into SketchUp. Actually kind of built some stuff in SketchUp, painted some textures that still felt kind of painterly, and they got super excited, and we ended up going more in a 3D space. The challenges for the set design in like our game are very unique because the kind of game we have is a side-scrolling game. You are doing side to side, and you have vertical. So you have basically a flat space, X and Y. I wanted to have the illusion and take advantage of parallax and depth and scale, but we had to do it in a way where you're running in your player plane with this massive world behind you. We had to make it very clear to the player that that's just eye candy. You can't go back there. Matter of fact, you don't want to go back there. There's nothing interesting back there. So there are a lot of design challenges of like, how do we give this sort of slightly immersive space that gives us a lot of visual variety without the player feeling frustrated that they're stuck on a track? How do we maximize the left to right progression? How do we have visual variety? How do we enable vertical breakup of that space? How do we break up large room, small room to create a rhythm to kind of, because again, you don't want like a monotone kind of experience. How do we use space and shape to create different mood and tone? If you go to kind of a creepy dark space, you go to a bright open space. Like again, like these games are very repetitive. I mean, you know, a lot of video games, you're doing the same thing over and over, and so it's really kind of up to the artists and the designers to make that experience not only aesthetically pleasing or interesting, but to be, in a way, trying to keep you engaged and interested and extend that gameplay so that you actually have, despite the monotony of the action, well, you have a progression of difficulty usually that kind of keeps you interested and engaged, right? You're getting reward, challenge and reward. But then the visuals also help with that so that you feel like, oh, there's a cool new space. I'm excited to go in there, right? And you're not getting bored. You know, I want to keep exploring the world. For me also, there's a lot of visual storytelling. The spaces had to communicate a sense of which side you were on, what time period you were in, what was the nature of that room, how did that sort of fit into the fiction of what these bad guys, these people were doing that you were trying to stop. So there's a lot of different factors. So it starts off with a lot of like concept art. I wanted to have a style that was very graphic and very reductive, but still dimensional. We were developing this as a mobile game originally. We did mobile and console. But how do we create a character in a world? The character's going to be quite tiny, and your screen size is like this big, right? How do we get it so that you can read the character in the world, you can read depth, you can read action and movement and all these things without it becoming too busy and too hard to read? So there's a lot of challenge in trying to find a style that could do that. There's also things like, again, let's see, let me skip through some of the stuff. I'll skip through characters. So this was sort of in the process of prototyping the world and just figuring out the base mechanics, figuring out kind of like what's just an initial visual language, what's like an initial visual flow idea, how do we get color variation for progression, but also specifically for this case this is a prototype level where the game flow was such that you had to revisit certain points. So you get to a certain point and realize, oh, I have to get something else to unlock this door. You go to where you need to get the key, and you realize, oh, I have to get this other thing before I can get the key, before I can get to the door. And so there's a process of discovery, and I wanted to use color coding of spaces so you can kind of like remember, oh, that was in the orange area, I'm in the blue area or something, or there'd be maybe different color codes so you have a sense of, oh, that's right, I'm downstairs or I'm upstairs. It's like landmarking kind of orientation kinds of cues. And again, just having visual variety. But this was bare bones. Like this is like the best I can do. This is kind of like ass. And what I do is I then work with people who are better than me and can make things look more awesome, and which is eventually what led from this to the actual game. Let's see, skipping more stuff here. So here's an example of trying to find a visual language too, like trying to find a space that communicates, that feels like a bunker. It feels like 1960s. It feels but it also feels like kind of like animation, but it's stylized and but still kind of grounded. There wasn't a lot of character. There was just me trying to play with scale, playing with large signage, playing with limited color palettes. And it just was still not that great, and kind of piecing it together into like a different work model flow in terms of the player progression. We had different kinds of navigable spaces, like tight vertical shafts and tight horizontal shafts, and big open spaces and big deep spaces. We were really starting to push the language or widen our vocabulary, but it was still like we didn't really have a clear set of rules yet, and we didn't really feel like we had a clear sense of the things that were working well. But you can tell from my original work was like this. I created a modular, we wanted to have sort of procedural levels, basically procedurally randomized levels, so that when you play a level, the engine will build a level for you out of mixing and matching different pieces. So when you play it again, you're getting something else. And every time you go to a new dungeon, as it were, you're getting a vast variety of dungeons, but it's with a smaller, we had to make fewer elements because it's mixing and matching constantly. But there was a lot of problem solving in terms of how do these things connect? How do we make sure a big room can connect to a small room? How does a 3-story room connect to a 1-story room? Can you connect rooms horizontally or vertically? So a lot of, like, again, kind of problem solving that comes with the mechanics of gameplay and the mechanics of the player progression through space. Do they go from room to room and it's just kind of random? Do you need to be able to remember where you're going, and do you go back? There's a lot of different ways to do it, and they require different solutions. When I was first doing the procedural stuff, I was thinking more about metrics and kind of the rules of proceduralization and how do I get the most variety of the fewest possible elements. But in the end, what I ended up with was that every room looked the same. Everything felt like it was made out of Legos, and there was no character. So then we began to try and create rooms that were unique, that maybe you couldn't reuse that room a lot because you would always recognize that room. But maybe there were other ways we could slice these up so that you could have distinct spaces that could be reused, or you could have distinct spaces that had stories. When people would play this game, they would say, oh yeah, I really enjoyed being in that room with the big red thing and the number 2 on it. And we were like, oh, wait, which room was that? Whereas now it's kind of like, oh, I like being in the room with the bombs, or I like being in the room with the hangar, or in the power plant or whatever. So we're trying to get a little more storytelling. There's the style exploration. I'll skip all this stuff. Sorry, this is a part of a larger thing. And then the style of the game and the style of the world was fairly distinctive. And I think for me, one of the things I was struggling with was that for the longest time, our character was really ungratifying, and because I'm not a character artist. And so it wasn't until we hired a character artist that we got characters that we liked. The characters were really distinct. And it was actually the character designs that really informed the look of the world, because it's like you're trying to, if you're just designing the world without the character, it's like you're trying to pick a frame, but you don't know what you're going to use, what painting you're going to put it on. So you kind of, for me, I tend to work holistically. I'll do a little bit of work in characters and a little bit of work on sets and a little bit of work on graphics, and all at the same time because they can begin to see how they start to inform each other and how they relate, and they can all kind of level up equally. And for the longest time, we were trying to level up the environment with kind of characters that had no style, had no character, really. And then once we got the characters we liked, it began to really become a target that we can apply now to the environment to make sure the environment serves the characters, because they live in the same world, and ultimately the environment is a frame for the characters' gameplay, and the character is usually the vehicle through which they do that. And of course, this is all dependent on where the camera is and all that kind, and how big it is on screen and all of that. But what I did, the smartest thing I did was like, okay, my character artist did such amazing character work. I said, start designing the environments. What were the rules? So if we look at his character design, sorry. Here we go. So the initial character stuff, oh man. Okay, so here's Milquetoast Man. And this is the stuff I kind of had directed and kind of come up with, and it was really generic and not very gratifying. And everybody would always ask, is that your character? Is that your final character? And then the environment also was kind of blobby and undefined. So it wasn't until we got we worked with Robert Valley, who's an amazing illustrator, character designer, art director. He designed this really angular, cool dude that we liked, and then I worked with a former student to really kind of make it work in 3D. Came up with this, I always wanted a very strong silhouettes, strong legibility. The character would always read in terms of profile. It was a striking graphic language. It has like a lithe quality, athletic quality to it. You can kind of see, how you can get these interesting silhouettes and shapes here. And then the guards, we only had 2 characters. We had the good guy and the guard in the game. We just didn't have the budget for anything else. And then kind of playing off of a lot of Soviet forms. As a set designer, as a designer, I do a lot of research. I always start in research. And I love like brutalist architecture. I love old Soviet architecture, propaganda. I love a lot of like modernism. And I'll dive more into this in a second. But for the characters, I wanted these characters to feel like sculptures, like these sculptures. And so the character artist nailed it. And we began to deconstruct what was it we liked about this stuff. And a part of it was the proportions. They're very tall, elongated characters. I really pushed them to not have too much 50-50, to have more of like a, sort of roughly 60-40 kind of breakup of masses, like where the waistline is and stuff, and longer legs, and blocked off squared shapes. And I wanted this to contrast with the spy. So this is square, spy is more angular. But then applying those rules to the environments, if I go back forward again, here. So this is him just sort of doing initial explorations with environment, playing with scale, verticality, large surface areas, large graphic signage, sharper edges, even integrating architectural, like sculptural forms into the architecture, using the character. I really pushed to have the characters be a part of the environment, almost literally as sculpture. And this just really began to inform the visual style. And even like, what is the outside world? How do organic shapes look in this very reductive graphic style? And the shameful part is we actually built some exterior worlds that were really beautiful and cool, and you would start outside and go inside and come outside again, and it all got thrown out. We ended up redesigning the game, so we didn't have any of those levels. The interesting thing, I think, for you, getting to a deeper level, is for me, there's a process of codifying things, of coming up with a design language, a design logic for stuff. This game, there's 3 parties. There's the East, there's the West, these 2 sides who are engaged in a Cold War arms race that's going to threaten the world. And it's sort of a satire on the real arms race. And you are this sort of self-aware, self-enlightened, progressive, secret spy agency run by some Steve Jobs type character. And it's your job to go back to infiltrate these sides and sabotage them to try to stop the arms race before they blow up the world. And so I need to visually communicate, and we're using a lot of the same, not the exact same geo in the environments, but the same types of settings. These 2 sides needed to be kind of like mirror reflections of each other, where from a satirical standpoint, they were enemies, they were the opposite, but they were also the exact same thing. They were both sides that were kind of like so fearful of the other side, they just kept stockpiling weapons. So there was a lot of kind of heavy work I needed to convey. So the first thing I kind of do is start to simplify it down and come up with like, if you look at a lot of like sort of US type stuff, how can you put a bunch of things together and begin to deconstruct it? What are common themes that can kind of come out of it? Or what are common themes you can extrapolate from it that become a shorthand that people will still associate with or recognize with that? And in this case of the West, it was a lot of mid-century architecture and a lot of the golden ratios and the squares and the sort of square-shaped language that I was finding was very common. And to me, that began to become like a shape language. And for the Soviets, it was a lot of the angular structures. And that's prevalent in their architecture. It's prevalent in their graphic design, the constructivist, earlier constructivist movement. And then color also. It's like, if I can distill it down to a shape and a color, that became for me almost like a core part of the DNA that would allow me to begin to, if I design things in this world kind of with that core idea in mind, it would help to unify them and to have, again, kind of an overriding theme. And then the counter stuff was also very well developed, that we ended up not having it in the game whatsoever. And then that began to kind of, I tried to then carry it across into these sets I would kind of build out and trying to bring in, we want to have more angled lines here and more flat lines here. We want to have more red here or blue here or what have you, just to again have these sort of predominant themes. And that was then scaled across, hundreds and hundreds of levels. Trying to think if there's anything else here that is relevant to the set design. If you guys, we're ending in 10 minutes, right? Okay. So I think I'll leave it, instead of going into the incredible stuff, I think I'll leave it open for questions. I hope that gave you a little bit of something there. Okay. Really? No more questions? You can either go early if you want to spare yourselves the next 10 minutes, or I can dive into some more stuff here. Oh, there we go.
All right. So you decided to leave Pixar.
Yes.
So how do you feel about Pixar as it is right now? And what are some problems they are facing or not facing?
Okay. This is being recorded, right? It's great. Well, no, I mean, I think I can be honest, and I think I can be diplomatic and hopefully fair, and hopefully not completely misrepresent anything. Pixar is an amazing studio. It has been or remains an amazing studio. It's doing some of the best work in the industry. And it's one of the best places, if not the best place to work in the industry. And I still love every single person there. Well, I think almost every person. And I'm still very excited and optimistic about what they will, how they will continue to fare without me. I've been gone now I left in 2011, and I left for a number of reasons. So, first of all, they've been around for a long time. I'd been there for a long time. And like any relationship, you begin to, you become molded to something. And I had reached a point in my life artistically where I didn't want to be molded by someone else. I wanted to be molding myself. So for me, it was a logical reason to leave. And I left with their blessing. And it's actually a common occurrence I think in the animation industry. It's a very specialized, very demanding career. And the nature, because these projects are so collaborative and so large, there's a natural tendency for them to want people to be in a very specific role where they are very predictable. You're always going to play third base. You're always going to be in this position. And what it does is it allows people to master a certain skill set, and their work becomes very predictable. And they have a very, I think, sort of linear kind of career growth where they get better at something. And I think a lot of people love that, but a lot of people don't. And so for me, it was like realizing that environment was not going to allow me to grow in the way I wanted to grow, and so I left. there's another layer on top of that in that Pixar was a very unique company, and I was very, very privileged to be a part of it early on. And it was very, very successful. I mean, almost impossibly successful. And success has its advantages and disadvantages. When you're that successful, it begins to create also sort of sometimes a the worst side of that is, well, here's an example. Like early on, the first several movies at Pixar, even up until, I think up until The Incredibles maybe, every film we worked on, we were kind of afraid could be a flop. We were afraid maybe no one would like it. We were afraid maybe it wouldn't be any good. We just didn't know. It was nervous. And if we got nominated for an Oscar, we were like, oh my God, let alone win an Oscar. And it was very much that kind of early underdog startup, put our hearts and souls into it. It's a big risk. It may not work. Failure happens. But then it kind of reached a point after a while where they knew what they were doing. They're so good. They kind of expected to win, you know, constantly. And there's a degree of less risk-taking. And things become more expensive, and they become bigger, and the stakes become higher. And also the industry is just a radically different place than it was in terms of box office revenues, in terms of all these new distribution channels. Movie studios are struggling everywhere. Animation studios are struggling. And so the rules of the game have changed externally that they're having to adapt to. And then the natural evolution of a company growing and becoming successful and having certain assumptions based on their success, they begin to maybe not take the same risks. So sometimes that can lead to a little bit of a cultural shift. And then Disney bought them. And then there was a layer of that. And then John and Ed became in charge of Disney and Pixar, and there was a change there. And then Steve Jobs died, and that Steve was a core part of the DNA that protected the spirit of the company. So they're still, again, they're still doing amazing things. There's still I can't say enough great things about them, but it's not the same place when I started. And when you're somewhere and you see it change, sometimes it's hard for you to adapt. So I became the old crotchety guy. Back in my days, we used to have 4 kinds of cereal. Now we just have 3, you know, and you lose perspective too. So, you know, it's a different company than it was, but you know, I still would, I highly recommend any of you go work there, you know. You know, I mean, I have, you know, and also just sometimes you grow apart from something because you've changed, right? So that's kind of how I feel about this. Like I used to be in a great marriage with Pixar, and we each moved on, and we still respect each other. So, and that's true of any job you'll have, I think. Well, any job you're at for 16 years anyway. So that's probably as much, yeah, as I'll say. Yeah.
Yeah, could you tell something about the Third Eye Studios production you're working?
Oh, God, thank you. How much are you getting paid, by the way? Did they pay you in advance or pay you after? Well, yeah, what made you ask? Was it because I mentioned it, or are you familiar with them? Yeah, because you mentioned it. Okay, I'm so glad you asked. So glad I mentioned it. I will show you, in theory, where's my talk? I don't know if it's in here. Where's my mouse? Anybody see my mouse? There you are. I don't think it's in here. Hang on, I gotta load it up. So Third Eye is a VR developer here in beautiful Helsinki. They are gentlemen from Remedy, from a couple of other studios. They were AAA guys. They recently set up shop, and they reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in kind of being a creative consultant to them. And I really liked what they were doing. And then I came out here and saw with my own eyes, and I really liked what they were doing. And I think that I'm hoping they can help kind of make a splash here for VR and help maybe get people excited. So trying to multitask here. Which deck is this in? I'm just gonna start opening these things, see if I can find it. I'll mute for now. No, it's not here. They what can I say? They've created a really unique experience. This is the same one. That they're trying to kind of blur the line between. So I think one of the shortcomings of VR right now is that people are approaching it from a point of reference. Like, I'm going to make a movie in VR and then try and figure out how to adjust it. I'm going to make a game in VR, figure out how to adjust it. I think in a way they're almost trying to find a different middle ground to create an experience in VR that's narrative, but the narrative is in how you play and in the playing of it and discovering space. And there's a bit of a puzzling aspect to it, but there's also how you navigate in the world is a really fascinating thing. It takes place in zero gravity. You're in a space station. It's kind of like 2001. And you're trying to like learn how to get around in zero gravity, and it's got physics. And there's something so gratifying about learning how to walk in space, and frustrating. And then you're picking up gadgets and equipment, and you're just sort of learning how to use this stuff. And then it's just, I think it's very successful in as leveraging this experiential medium in a way that these other things don't, or in a way these other things have to fight it or compensate for it. So I highly recommend you guys look them up. And if you guys have any kind of community, gaming groups or VR groups or whatever here, reach out to them. And I think I see like a lot of potential here in this community, a lot of excitement. You guys coming out of school, I think they're kind of like a little bit of a forerunner. They're maybe 10 or 20 years ahead of you guys because they've been doing games for a while, but they're almost as new to VR as you guys are. So, and I think having also a tight-knit community, it's really great that I'm hoping that they can become kind of a beacon and also excite other people to do it. It's also very risky right now. There's not the VR marketplace. The tech is kind of there, and the content is coming along in baby steps. The market is not there yet. So until all these things coincide, it's going to be kind of a period of innovation and risk-taking and experimenting, and again, making those early movies or whatever until finally it becomes a really defined art form. But you guys should be pretty excited. And again, whether it's VR or games or anything else, it's all good stuff. But I'm trying to find this thing. I'm sorry. Oh, maybe it's here? I think it's here. Fingers crossed. There we go. So here's a trailer. And this does not do justice to what it is like wearing it. I'm quite surprised. And it's multiplayer. And it's not a shooting game, although there is shooting. And in multiplayer, you talk to each other. And it's on Steam now, so go get it. So the prologue is on Steam. It's basically like a trailer, but I mean it's like a short pilot episode where there's a kind of a beginning, middle, and end, and it sort of sets up the main game, which they're just starting on now. But pretty exciting, actually, and they're really nice guys. And that's probably a good place to end. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. A few short plugs before we thank Mark. on Friday, our own students are having an exhibition of visual narrative stuff in the Otaniemi free space. Is it the free space? Yep, okay. That's on Friday at 7. You can see it on our Facebook page. Also join the game.
3 to 5 here, Game Jam Games.
3 to 5, come here, see the Game Jam Games, then go over there and have a party. Free beer. Can I say that? Done.
Can
Free
you
beer.
schedule that to today so I can come?
Free beer all the time.
Yeah.
And then join the Games Now lecture series too. Is it over for this year?
Yes, next time continues in autumn.
Yes, okay, so join that in autumn. And then join me in thanking Mark Holmes very much for coming and telling us all this amazing stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And you can still ask me questions if you want. I can hover for a bit. But I'm going to take this off. I hope it was okay. It was a little unstructured. But
No, it's fantastic. You covered so much ground. I think you satisfied everyone. So, thanks.